Welcome to Taking Up Space, the podcast with conversations exploring what it means to inhabit our bodies fully without shame or apology and reconnect with our innate wisdom to find healing and body liberation. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski, a licensed clinical social worker, certified sex therapist, and certified body trust practitioner. For over 10 years, I've worked with women and marginalized folks to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives in a world that often seeks to diminish their voices and experiences. In this podcast, we'll unpack the societal norms and expectations that interrupt our embodiment, like trauma, oppression, illness and pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. My hope is that through this podcast, we'll learn to drop into our bodies and give ourselves permission to occupy space, physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually, with more confidence and authenticity. Join us as we challenge societal norms, explore what it means to find wholeness and reclaim our right to take up space as an act of resistance and body liberation. While this podcast might feel therapeutic, it is not psychotherapy and doesn't constitute a therapist-client relationship. This is a good time to mention, too, that this podcast will at times use adult language, so listener discretion is advised. If you are interested in diving in deeper, make sure you check out my online shop where I'm currently offering my Taking Up Space workbook for free. This workbook includes thought-provoking exercises, reflective journal prompts, and actionable strategies that can help guide you towards a deeper understanding of yourself and your needs and cultivate a more profound sense of embodiment and your own liberation. You can find this workbook and other resources at my website. That's inneratlastherapy.com/shop. Hey there, welcome back to Taking Up Space. Today, we're diving into a conversation that's incredibly close to my heart, the tangled relationship between ADHD and our struggles with food and body image. Here's the truth. People with ADHD are 4 times more likely to develop an eating disorder, and it's a cycle that can feel impossible to break. When eating disorders go untreated, they can make ADHD symptoms even worse. And when ADHD isn't managed or recognized, it can wreak havoc on our relationship with food and our bodies. And I don't think the eating disorder treatment world is talking about this overlap enough, nor is it adequately addressing the needs of folks who have both ADHD and disordered eating. Treatment tends to be designed for very neurotypical brains. And this lack of recognition keeps so many of us trapped in a cycle of shame and confusion because the core issues driving the disordered relationship with food and body aren't being addressed. And for so many of us, I think this is the missing puzzle piece in really finding healing in our relationship with food and our bodies, especially if we've been fighting this battle for what feels like forever and we can't seem to get traction in recovery. So this conversation is going to tackle what it means to look at ADHD and disordered eating head on and working on those things together, using an integrated approach to look at the whole person and understand that these conditions are interconnected. But when we look at both, we can also truly start to heal and reclaim our well-being. So joining me today to have this conversation is expert Aleta Storch. Aleta is a highly regarded dietitian, therapist, and certified body trust provider, and a leading expert in the field of ADHD nutrition. Aleta specializes in providing neurodivergent, affirming, value-centered body liberation work with folks that have ADHD, disordered eating, a history of dieting, and autoimmune conditions. Aleta is the owner and founder of a virtual group practice, Wise Heart Nutrition. She's also created a groundbreaking approach called Eating with ADHD and a monthly membership program called Nourished, spelled Neurshd, which she developed as a resource for supporting folks with ADHD in understanding their brain and breaking out of the chaos in order to find more freedom and joy and make lasting changes in their relationship with food and eating. And in my conversation with Aleta today, we're not only unpacking the concept of a body story, but also introducing the concept of having a brain story. We're going to dive into why so many folks, especially those assigned female at birth, experience delayed recognition and diagnosis of ADHD and eating disorders. We'll explore the cultural and systemic factors that contribute to this delay, shedding light on the challenges faced by those navigating these complex intersections of identity and mental health. And we'll discuss the increased risk that folks with ADHD face for developing eating disorders and the underlying reasons behind this correlation. Understanding how ADHD impacts one's relationship with their body and food is crucial for providing effective support. And just to name two, that not everyone with ADHD will develop an eating disorder, and the relationship between the two conditions is complex and varies among individuals. However, I do think that understanding this connection and exploring it can really help folks find a pathway through to what healing can look like for them. And as I mentioned, eating disorder treatment and mental health treatment in general tends to be very neurotypical and not neurodivergent friendly. Even frameworks like intuitive eating can be really designed for neurotypical brains and not neurodivergent brains. There can feel like so much chaos and overwhelm in eating with an ADHD brain. And we know that interoceptive awareness and the ability to discern what's happening inside your body can look different for an ADHD brain too. So the concept and the practice of embodiment can be pretty tricky. So, throughout our conversation, Aleta is going to share her valuable insights and practical strategies for repairing one's relationship with food, particularly those with ADHD. So, whether you're someone navigating these challenges yourself, or maybe you're seeking to better understand the experiences of others, this episode promises to offer you valuable insights and empowering strategies for healing and growth. So, stay tuned as Aleta and I dive deeper into this topic and explore strategies for support and healing. Hey there, Aleta. Welcome to Taking Up Space. I'm really excited you're here. Thanks for your willingness to talk with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cassie. I'm really excited about this podcast.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah. So I started working in higher level of care treatment for eating disorders right out of grad school. I knew that was the population that I really wanted to focus on. And I very quickly noticed that ADHDers and other folks who were neurodivergent were and continue to be a really underserved and specialized population within the field of eating disorder
Yeah.
treatment. And so I was like, great, I'm just going to jump in with both feet. And since
Mhm.
then, I've really just been focusing on supporting ADHDers with food and eating, developing, creating a neurodivergent, affirming, and weight inclusive lens
Mm.
to provide more information, more resources, and a clear approach for professionals as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm super excited to talk with you about all of that because I think there's this renaissance and folks talking about neurodivergence, and specifically in the eating disorder space, of better understanding the overlap there and how they play off of each other. So I'm excited to learn from you and your experience there. But before we get there, I'm wondering if you could share a bit about how your own body story impacts the work that you do, like how you arrived into this specialization.
Yeah, that is a great question and not one that I had really thought about in those terms. I appreciate that. My story feels really entwined with my brain story. Understanding my ADHD brain and its differences has been really essential in getting like more of a clear picture of my own experience in my body and moving away from some of those like disordered eating patterns and behaviors. And so having ADHD has meant that I have always either felt really disconnected from my body or
Mm.
incredibly hyper attuned to the sensations that were showing up in my body. And
Uh-huh.
it's taken a lot of experimentation and practice and self
Mm.
compassion to get to a place where I have more of an awareness and I have the tools and the skills to check in and notice and interpret
Mm.
those cues. And also being kind to myself, not beating myself up when I don't have that awareness or I don't have the capacity to tend to those needs. And I've also just gained a lot of insight around like sensory input and how
Mhm.
my body experience maybe is different than someone else who doesn't have a neurodivergent brain. Yeah. And so before making these connections, I struggled so much with food and eating. And that's been
Mm.
such a key for me.
Mhm. Mm.
I love the concept of a brain story. Like I've never really thought of that, but I hear like the distinction between brain and body story and also the parallel and the intersection of those is really key to understanding the whole of yourself, it sounds like.
Yes, yeah. And I feel like that brain story gets missed so much. Like when we're exploring what is it like to be in our bodies. Yeah.
Yeah, can you share more about like the brain story and like what that means to you, just to articulate to some of our listeners and just so we have a
Yeah.
common frame
Yes.
there for that?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess speaking to my personal experience, growing up with ADHD, I was really unorganized. I didn't have a lot of follow through. I didn't feel smart. Like I really struggled to do well in school. There were just a lot of things that I felt like I was not good at. And so
Mm,
I always felt like I was broken or there was something really wrong with me. This idea now of like I should be able to adult and I can't even adult. And
mm,
that story still shows up and I'm
mhm,
better able to notice it and right, remind myself that that's not
mhm.
true. But I think before I officially got the diagnosis, it was just I was like, I have a deficit. There's something wrong with me, and I don't know
Ah,
why I'm
wow.
not able to do all of these things, right? And getting diagnosed with ADHD, and we talked a little bit about this before getting on. It created a lot of grief, right?
Mm,
Around, man, I wish I had known that sooner because maybe I would have been
mm,
nicer to myself, right? And I wouldn't have had this terrible story about who I am. And
mm.
then also a lot of acceptance and validation of, oh, there's a reason for that. Right.
Mm,
I'm not broken. And it's just, yeah, it's just the way that my brain works. And that's okay.
yeah. Ah, what a beautiful way to change your relationship with shame when it's normalized and there's more acceptance and working with your brain versus this is some internalized feeling on my end.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And understanding, right? It's the system that is
Mm,
telling me I'm
mm,
broken, very similar to like for a lot of people, their body story, right? It's
yeah,
not your body that's wrong. It's not your brain that's wrong. It's that we live
right.
in a world that doesn't make space for those things to exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. For bodies that don't align with whatever ideals. And then
Hmm.
also like neurotypical brains, there's only space for that versus neurodivergent brains.
Yeah,
Mm,
exactly.
wow. I have so many friends. So here I am in my late 30s, and I have a number of friends who women diagnosed later in their adulthood with ADHD, and it's opened up like a different frame of viewing themselves and lots of grief, but also acceptance and movement through. But I'm curious in your mind, as we were talking about like the systems, the cultural systems, other layers of oppression, of how that impacts women specifically, or other folks for that matter, having a delayed recognition or a diagnosis for them.
Yeah. Yes. As you've probably noticed, there's been a sharp increase in ADHD diagnosis in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with a broadened understanding of what ADHD looks like. We've always seen ADHD as this very traditional, like
Hmm.
young, white, cis male, that they're hyperactive and they're out of control. And that just is not the full picture because it presents very differently in across the gender spectrum and
Yeah.
in different ages, right? My ADHD presented very differently as a kid than what it
Mm.
does now.
Mm.
And then, like you said, culturally, right? What is considered acceptable or appropriate within one culture might not be within another. And then, of course, like systemic oppression, right? People not having access to diagnosis is going to put another layer on preventing people from getting the diagnosis and the care and the treatment that they need. Did that
Yeah.
answer your question? Is that what you
Yeah.
were?
No,
Okay.
totally.
Okay.
And
Great.
yeah, as a follow-up, I was wondering, hyperactivity, impulsivity, those types of features are a component of ADHD, but what are the features that get missed, you think? And now as
Yeah.
people are moving through their lives, they're encountering these symptoms differently.
Yeah, I think the hyperfixation, hyper
Yeah.
focus often gets seen as right. Oh, you're an overachiever. You couldn't possibly have ADHD.
Mm.
And for a lot of those people, yeah, when it's something I love and like I have the energy, I can do
Mhm.
that. But
Yeah.
then everything else goes by the wayside, right? I haven't made my bed in months, that of
Mm.
thing. I think that some of the disorgan inability to plan can get really easily overlooked, even the emotional dysregulation. And I
Mm.
think, especially for folks who are female presenting, there's just this assumption that we, quote, don't have control of our emotions. And yeah, we, during our periods, we're going to be really overly emotional.
Yeah.
When really that might be an inability to regulate and modulate emotions. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that get missed. And it's more of that, there's the hyperactive and then the inattentive. So the inattentive symptoms aren't really, being paid attention to.
And just so I think in traditional, I'll just say like American schooling, like that is rewarded and overlooked. And instead, all the attention goes on maybe this other more disruptive symptom to the whole classroom or
Totally. Yeah. Someone might look like they're paying attention, but they're like totally zoned out, thinking about a million different things. Jimmy in the corner is like throwing paper airplanes and getting in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. And hearing you describe some of those features, I'm already starting to make connections with the overlap with eating disorders or disordered relationships with food or body. But one of the stats that I read is that folks with ADHD are 4 times as more likely to develop an eating disorder. And could you connect that dot? What is it about an ADHD brain that makes folks more susceptible to developing an eating disorder?
Yeah. Like you said, there's a huge overlap. And so I guess through my work with clients and my own personal journey, I've come up with essentially 2 different pathways that can lead to this. And someone can develop an eating disorder through both of those pathways. It's not like one or the other, 2 big influencing factors.
Okay.
And the first is that the eating disorder can serve as a way of making up for these perceived deficits that so many ADHDers experience. So that brain story is going to make us feel better about our brains. We spend a lot of our lives thinking we're lazy or we're not smart or we're annoying, we're unreliable, and controlling food, controlling our body can provide a sense of accomplishment or discipline, right? That normalcy that we're looking for. So meeting those important human needs, the eating disorder can really serve to do that for us. Disordered eating can also lead to numbness and disconnection from emotion. And since emotional dysregulation is a hallmark feature of ADHD, the eating disorder can serve as a self-medication for this. And then the second reason for the overlap is that the executive dysfunction, the emotional regulation that come with having ADHD can actually make it really hard to notice our body's food needs, to make a plan for eating or complete tasks like grocery shopping or prepping, cooking, cleaning, right? All the things that go along with that. And it can also affect things like decision making around food or feeling excitement and interest in meals and snacks. And then ADHDers often also use food and eating to provide dopamine and stimulation that are typically lacking or needed in higher amounts for those with ADHD brains. So I guess this second pathway is the symptomology of ADHD leads to the behaviors that present like a more traditionally thought of eating disorder. But the underlying motivation or the cause is different. And a lot of ADHDers actually struggle with unintentional restriction. That's what this all comes back to.
Oh, say more on that, being aware of hunger cues or maybe medication too, I'm thinking of.
Totally.
Yeah.
So all these things, or just not having any groceries in the house and feeling hungry, but being I don't have anything to eat, or I'm literally just eating potato chips for lunch and that's all I've eaten all day. That can lead to, there's restriction, there's binge eating, there's purging, and ADHDers are just so much more susceptible because of that baseline of undernourishment. And that can just lead to so many difficulties.
What's interesting, I hear when we talk about dopamine in the brain with food, there's this whole narrative around food addiction and lights up this center of your brain. And I mean, we could have a whole episode on why that's problematic and debunking that. But I'm curious if you encounter that with the folks that you work with occasionally. Oh, well, it lights up my dopamine center. It must mean I'm addicted to food. What do you say to that?
Yes. Oh my gosh. If I had $1 for every time I heard that, I wouldn't need to be working. And so much of that is coming from diet culture, right? This idea that we should only eat when we're hungry and it should be a certain thing and we should stop when we're full. And if we're eating for reasons outside of hunger, then we're somehow doing something wrong. But food is actually a really great, easy, accessible for most people source of dopamine. And in order for us to function at a level that most people want to be showing up in, we need that extra dopamine. And so if like crunchy food is going to give that to you, that's great, right? That is providing you with the dopamine that you need to show up in the rest of your life. So I think just really doing a lot of normalization around that. And there are other tools for dopamine too, right? Like you don't just have to use food. There's nothing wrong with it if you do, but there are lots of other ways to get that as well. And so doing a lot of like challenging those food rules or the diet culture messaging around, right? You can't stop, or you're using this when you're not hungry, so you must be addicted.
Oh, I love the premise, like the permission to still eat in that, and also giving space of like, and there are other ways that we can support your brain with that legitimate need of dopamine.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've already mentioned a few of these things, but I'm to maybe drill down a little bit more specifically. How does having ADHD or neurodivergence impact someone's relationship with their body specifically, or being able to connect to their body or trust their body?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the big one is the idea of interoceptive awareness, which is essentially like our ability to notice or identify cues within our body, our internal cues, right? Noticing when we're thirsty, noticing when we have to pee, noticing when we're tired or cold. And ADHDers most often really struggle with this on kind of both sides of the coin. So we really lack awareness for those cues when they aren't screaming at us, when they're thinking about like hunger and fullness scale, right? If someone is at a 4, which is like hungry, an ADHDer might not notice that until it's a 1 and we're ravenous and we're like gonna pass out.
And that cues like binge eating, perhaps, or like
Exactly.
compulsivity, or
Yes, exactly. And then on the other side, now I don't notice when I'm full because I can't tune into that. And then there's also the hyper awareness of, oh my gosh, now I'm so full and I'm so uncomfortable and that's all I can think of. And now I'm really emotionally dysregulated. Or I'm so hungry and that's all I can think about. And now I'm emotionally dysregulated. And then just like different sensations, like not liking or being really uncomfortable with different sensations related to food can impact the way that we're eating.
How do you support people in building their own interoception? Because that's something that I do with a lot of folks with disordered eating, disordered relationships with food in their body anyway, of like cluing back in. But I'm guessing with an ADHD brain, it might look a little bit different to help people clue in, since there's that brain chemistry component that you're working with there.
Yeah. And I think in a traditional approach, right, with someone who's neurotypical, the idea is like relying on interoceptive awareness to guide how we're eating. And with folks who have ADHD, it's more about how do we create these opportunities, these reminders, these cues to do a body scan, to notice, to pay attention to, right? Because we might not just have that.
No matter how many skills we build or whatever, that may not arrive for you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And there are ways to develop that, and starting with something that's not hunger. And so it could be like putting your hands in ice water and just like noticing the sensation. One of the ones is like trying to be able to feel your heartbeat without actually touching your chest. And I struggle with that so much, but it's like a skill that I'm trying to develop. And as you develop skills in other areas, it can help translate to more of a hunger, thirst, interoception. Yeah.
All of this conversation and this discussion around interoception is making me think about intuitive eating, which is like such a common modality in weight inclusive care and HAES. It always seems to come right alongside that. But I could see where with someone with an ADHD brain or a neurodivergent brain, intuitive eating may be extra challenging, or I don't know, you tell me, maybe it's not the best course of action in the treatment.
Yeah, you are spot on. I often hear from ADHDers like, I tried intuitive eating and I failed at it. So obviously it doesn't work for me, which like brain story showing
Yeah, that's old, right?
Right. Yeah, that narrative's maybe not the most helpful. And so intuitive eating as it was created is a really amazing approach, but it assumes that we have access to those internal cues and the motivation for nourishing our body. And that's not always going to be true for ADHDers. And so there's this belief that like relying on external cues and reminders, or having like maybe some more structure, maybe not rigid, but having some structure in place to guide our eating, that's not in line with the intuitive eating approach. But I actually see those as like accommodations, ADHD accommodations that make intuitive eating a little bit more approachable, a little bit more realistic for neurodivergent brains. And so I guess like the goal for intuitive eating with ADHD is more about putting systems in place that give us more opportunities, like I said, to check in with our bodies, to provide support for eating when we can't access hunger and fullness, or when we can't identify what would taste good or what's satisfying, or we just don't have the motivation to feed ourselves. And so a lot of it's more like logistics versus tuning in or feeling like we have to always be body aware, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love neurodivergent affirming care. That's one way that it can look, right? And I don't know if it's standard practice for whether it's eating disorder treatment centers or individual outpatient practitioners, therapists, or dietitians to screen for ADHD, because this seems like such a critical piece of information before we broadly apply, here's intuitive eating, this is what we're going to do. And if this is on board, it's like you're setting someone up to feel like they're a failure or not doing it right, or like their perfectionism, like all this old coping strategy that they've had to do their whole life. Like, I'm not doing this the way that I should be doing it. What's wrong with me?
Yeah. Yeah. And like the relapse rate for ADHD,
Hmm.
when people step down from higher level of care, right, in a partial hospitalization, there is a lot
So
of
much
external.
structure.
Yeah. And then stepping down, it's, oh, I thought I was an intuitive eater, and now I don't know what I'm doing. And so then people, right, struggle and have to be readmitted. And if we address the ADHD at the same time that we're addressing the eating disorder, then someone like actually has the capacity to take care of themselves outside of that setting. But without that, it's not really going to help.
Yeah. I wonder if some of it is starting with screening, I think is really critical. I don't do screening with my clients routinely unless there seems to be some like indication. And I will say I'm getting more familiar with like just seeing through this lens and ensuring that I'm checking for this. Folks, whether it's ADHD or autism for that matter, and like how that shows up in their relationship with food or their body, like screening and like ensuring that, we're really placing accurately, like what's your brain versus what's something else, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. I feel like that is a good reminder. Yeah. So I think a big part of it is like working together as a team. So everyone is on the same page. And like you said, screening for these things. So we know, is there this extra component that we need to address, right? We're going to screen for something like depression. Are we not screening for ADHD? And I think being able to think more about the logistics outside of care, because what's learned in the treatment process isn't necessarily always going to translate. And so a lot of neurodivergent affirming care is actually just like setting up those systems and setting up that structure so that the person can continue to use those skills and continue to do their recovery. And that might mean like a lot more accountability. It might mean having them work with an ADHD coach once they step down. And I think a lot of providers have maybe like a negative or reverse reaction to coaching. When it's such an incredible tool.
Resource for sure.
Yeah, just have that weekly touch point. Accountability is huge. Not expecting people to remember things between sessions. So I, at the end of sessions, write some notes down, talk about, okay, here's what we covered. And then I just take 30 seconds and email it to the client so that they at least have it. And I know some providers feel like that's like enabling, or they shouldn't, like the client should be responsible for that. But that little thing can make such a huge difference, where people aren't like, oh, I totally forgot what we talked about last week. Now I feel like a failure, right? Like I'm not even doing this right. Yeah. And then just like challenging the neuronormativity that we're existing, and like understanding those stories, similar to identifying food rules, right? What are your brain rules or expectations about how you should be showing up? Yeah, those are just some ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, the brain rules. Oh, that just lit something up inside for me. I'm like, what are my own brain rules,
Yes.
right? I think we all have them,
Yeah.
like wherever we fall on the spectrum of neurodivergence.
Yes.
That can be a helpful line of discussion regardless.
Yeah. Like,
Mm.
where did this narrative come from? Like, why do
Mhm.
you think you should be able to do the dishes every single night without
Mm.
fail? Yeah. Where is that coming from? How is that helping or harming?
One of the visuals and thoughts, ideas that I have seen from your Instagram account is the pyramid of food needs that often go unmet with folks with ADHD. And I was hoping you could share a little bit more about that model and that framework and how it applies to the work that you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it is the basis for all of the work
Yeah.
that I do with ADHD clients, neurodivergent clients, and even
Mhm.
neurotypical clients. I keep
Mhm.
coming back to this, and
Mm.
it's based off of like several different models, right? So intuitive eating, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then Ellen Satter's pyramid of food needs. And I just reordered some of them thinking about what is a neurodivergent brain need? What is the foundational need for us?
Mm.
And that's actually just going to be eating enough. So if
Mm.
eating enough and regular eating every 3 to 4 hours, and not worrying about what type of food are we getting variety? Is it enjoyable? And that's a really hard one for ADHDers, right? we,
Enjoying
we
food, finding pleasure in food.
or worrying about not enjoying food, it not being perfect. So
Oh,
the
okay.
fear of discipline can lead to overcomplicating, overthinking, avoidance. And so we say, okay, we'll get to that. I want you to be able to eat all the foods that give you like all the pleasure, all the satisfaction. But for now, just eat something. It doesn't matter what.
Is
And
it,
once I'm,
oh, sorry to interrupt
oh, go
you.
ahead.
Is it like a FOMO concept? Am I going to choose the most pleasurable thing, or should I actually choose this other thing because that might be more tasty or more satisfying? Is that kind of how it shows up?
Yes, yes. And I
Okay.
think that's a really good term, right? Like the FOMO that we experience
Huh.
because ADHD brains, the reward center actually needs more dopamine to activate it. And we
Right.
thrive on reward, we thrive on pleasure. And so if a meal is then we're not getting that
Mhm.
dopamine. And then that's again that emotional dysregulation sets in that now I'm frustrated, now I'm disappointed, I'm discouraged. And that can feel almost intolerable. And so then it
Mm.
creates this cycle of it has to be perfect or I'm not going to eat it. So addressing that is a big one. And then variety, right? We'll talk about variety, we'll talk about pleasure, we'll talk about gentle nutrition.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I took us a little bit away from the pyramid, but is there anything more on that pyramid that is worth mentioning? Or maybe that was just it, the gentle
Yeah.
nutrition and
Yeah, I think knowing like it's not a linear model. So some people are like, okay, I've mastered eating right? Or regularly. Now I can move on to the next step. And it really isn't this progression. Some days and moments, it's going to be easier to tend to all of those food needs. And then we can lean into pleasure and satisfaction. But some days, like the only focus that we need to have is on that foundational, right? Eating regularly, eating enough so that then we can attend to those food needs later when we're feeling a little bit better. And so I think it's like understanding the pyramid, being able to identify where are we at on the pyramid in this moment is probably like one of the most important skills for ADHDers who are healing their relationship with food because it can determine like how am I going to approach this meal or snack. Yeah.
what a helpful framework to anchor back into when things feel a little bit messy and chaotic. It's, okay, let me look at this pyramid and find myself in it and just start there. Mm,
Yep. Exactly.
nice. I'm curious for you, as we've talked about some of those systemic and cultural influences on our body stories and our brain stories, and I'm guessing a component of the work for you with the folks that you're working with is this parallel process of navigating both ADHD and their eating disorder, navigating both the body they have and the brain they have, and maybe some of the parallel processes that show up there and moving through those experiences while there's this cultural systemic nature to how those are influenced. Can you share more about some of that work that you do?
Yeah, yeah. And that, like, the kind of brain story, body story is such a good kind of example of that, where ADHDers who are struggling with an eating disorder or exist in larger bodies and experience fat phobia are actually like swimming upstream against neuronormativity. They're swimming upstream against diet and wellness culture. And it can be really hard to tease out like what parts of the
Mm.
struggle are ADHD and what parts are maybe more rooted in the eating disorder. And so I have to be really careful in my work with clients not to enable the eating disorder, but also not to invalidate the
Oh,
ADHD.
yeah, that's tricky.
And so as a provider, I basically have to let go of all assumptions and work with each individual client to really dig in and start to help them make sense of their own unique experience.
Mm.
And so I put a lot of trust in my clients because the goal of our work together is for them to develop their own body and brain trust. And they can't do that if I'm not giving them the space to explore what that looks like on their own. So that really gives people the opportunity to identify what's going on in my brain, what's going on in my body, how are these overlapped, how are these separate? And it's like a giant puzzle that we
Yeah.
just put together slowly. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and it's not boilerplate. Like it has to be really individualized. And I think that's just so beautiful how you partner with your clients in that way and really instill that trust in them and in their process as they navigate it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I would like, that's what I got in my experience of getting care. I feel
Mm.
very lucky. I just happen to have amazing providers who really let me guide the work,
Mm.
and so recognizing like the value of that.
Mhm. How does grief work intersect here?
Yes, there's so much grief work. Part of it is it starts with diagnosis, right? And recognizing, yes, maybe your life would have been different if you had known this sooner. A lot of the grief work is around like letting go of these ideas of who we're supposed to be. So
Yeah.
letting go of the thin ideal, right? Letting go of dieting as a solution or as a fix. Letting go of right what it means to have a brain that functions neurotypically. And so really like working through those different pieces and those different stories was huge.
Yeah, and any grief process isn't linear too, so I'm guessing it just ebbs and flows as people go through their process and
Yes.
mm,
Yeah, I think something I hear so often is, "Oh, here we go again," right? Like I was able
mhm.
to do something for 2 weeks and then I just
Yeah,
stopped doing it. And so just being able to acknowledge, right? That
yeah,
sucks. That
yeah,
sucks to not be
yeah.
able to be consistent
Mm,
and having grief over that and noticing, okay, like how do we move forward in a way that's like values aligned,
mhm,
knowing that like we don't get to be that person that does that thing every single day for the rest of our life that builds that really easy habit, and
mm,
food suddenly feels right like
yeah,
easy and a no-brainer.
yeah.
Yeah, so grief, I would say grief comes in like every session with
Mhm,
clients, and like I still experience a lot of it.
mhm. Yeah, it's grief is never one of those experiences where it feels like you check a box and like I'm done. Like different layers open up as we go through our own experiences and as our bodies and brains change and we evolve. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and right, leaning into it is the way through it. It's
Yeah.
I think how we talked about it in the body trust certification is,
Yeah.
yeah, it's so uncomfortable. No one wants to go through grief, and it's
Yeah.
so important.
What's on the other side of grief? Not that we're ever beyond it, but as we move through it, what's kind of the outcomes that you've seen or the benefits that you've seen of people like getting uncomfortable and leaning in to the grief?
Yeah, I would say learning is a huge one,
Mm,
right? Like when we allow ourselves to be uncomfortable, to
mm,
experience disappointment, frustration, there is a lot of learning that comes from
mhm,
that. And then it opens us up to experimentation and to doing things a little bit differently. I think there's a lot more kindness when we
mhm.
can say, yes, and again, this sucks. And here's something I can do to take care of myself, even if it's not the thing that I thought that I should be doing.
Mm,
Self compassion.
mm,
I found ADHDers really struggle with self compassion because of those narratives, those negative narratives that are going on. And just allowing someone to go through that grieving process, self-compassion feels a little bit more accessible. Okay, my life has been really hard. This has been really uncomfortable. So it's not like all rainbows and butterflies on the other side, the other side of grief.
Totally.
But there's more
Absolutely.
space to exist as a
Yeah.
human.
Yeah. And body acceptance, body neutrality is a big feature in some of the work that I do with folks in this area. But I'm just thinking in this context, like brain acceptance or brain neutrality, maybe another one of those parallel processes that happens here.
Yes. Yeah. That is such a good point, right? We're not aiming for someone to love their body every single day or even
Mhm.
ever. And similarly, we're not aiming to love our brains, but just to be like, okay, this is what it is. And just
Yeah.
being okay with that
Mhm.
discomfort. Yeah.
Mhm.
Love that.
I'm sure there are some people listening right now that are like, oh shit, do I have ADHD?
Yes.
So if that's, what would you say to those folks listening right now? They're like, oh my God, I never thought about this, but hearing about this, it just resonates so much. And now what do I do with that information? How would you guide or support people in that position?
Yeah. I used to say, go to your provider and get an assessment. And
Uh-huh.
I think that there's like some back end work that needs to be done that will help someone go through that process with a little bit more ease. And so I would say go online, download some like checklists of like these are ADHD symptoms, especially in adults, and just spend a couple weeks writing things down. Oh, I noticed that from like maybe this checkbox, this symptom really showed up, and like gathering information and being your own scientist so
Mhm.
that
Oh, I love
if
that.
and when you can see a provider, you can say, okay, here's an example of how this actually showed up. I forgot my laundry was in the washing machine for 3 weeks, and then I ran out of underwear, and all I had was like moldy wet underwear. That's a really
Yeah,
good
that's
example.
real. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so I think that can help ADHDers also feel a little bit more validated because
Mhm.
oftentimes people will be like, do I really have it? I don't know.
Yeah, not being
Uh,
believed, not
yes, and
believing
not
their own
believing
experience.
ourselves. So I would say start by just gathering information,
Mm.
connecting with communities. Yeah.
Mhm. Like online communities maybe, or
Mhm. Yeah,
okay.
there's a lot of good Facebook groups out there. Some of them
Okay.
less good than others. Obviously, no, there's a lot of diet culture that goes on in those groups,
Mhm.
unfortunately. But just being able to read about some other people's experience and notice, like, does that resonate? Does that feel like, that doesn't really match what I'm feeling? And also knowing you're not going to have the same experience as every
Yeah.
single ADHD. We are all so different. Yeah, you can have two ADHDers with completely opposite symptoms.
Mhm. Mhm.
And knowing that is true too.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really important. Alita, what does it mean for you to take up space in your own life right now?
I love this question. So I was thinking about this before we started talking. And I think for me, taking up space means just like making space for all of the parts of me. It means acknowledging and honoring the needs of my brain and body without feeling bad or feeling guilty for being different. A good example, speaking of examples, a good example of this comes to mind from just a few days ago. My husband and I were planning to go out to eat, and it had been a really long week. I had just seen 4 clients. I was exhausted. And in the past, I would be like, well, I find the perfect restaurant. I'm going to like read all the reviews, right? Like I am going
Right.
to this out, but like
Right.
I feel overwhelmed. And then I would just shut
Mm.
down
Mm.
and be in tears. And then it was like, okay, now we can't even make a decision, right? We're just
Mhm.
going to heat up some mac and cheese, which is
Mhm.
fine. And so then I just asked my husband, without any apologies, without any excuses, I was like, my brain can't make a decision right now. Can you pick a restaurant tonight or pick two? And then we can talk about it together and narrow down and decide on one of those. And he knows now that's not an excuse and that's actually a real thing for me. So that's his cue to like, okay, you're going into like decision fatigue
Yeah.
and overwhelm. I'm going to do this. And that just feels embodied. It feels liberating
Mhm.
and like a way of taking up space in my own life.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love how you've shared your own lived experience here and also how you're in process. I think there's just creates so much spaciousness and permission for us all to be in process as well. as we're on this path of healing and embodiment and body liberation, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. All the things, right? Like food, eating, brain. Yeah, none of us have it all figured out.
Yeah. Aleta, it has been so much fun to hear you talk about your expertise and just learn so much from you. I know folks are really going to benefit and reflect, whether they're a clinician or whether they're a client or someone else, just on their own experience and their own brain story, perhaps. So I'm excited for this to get out into the world. But if people want to continue to connect with you or find your work, how do you recommend that they do that?
Yeah, so I guess easiest place is my website, which is wiseheartnutrition.com. And that has links to kind of everything. I'm also on Instagram as the_ADHD_RD, and I'm most active there. And I have a Facebook group, ADHD, Intuitive Eating for ADHD, and it's open to anyone. So if you're looking for a place to start, and that's a good place to connect with community.
Amazing. We'll put all of that in the show notes.
Awesome. Perfect.
Aleta,
It was
thank you
lovely.
again. What a fun conversation. And to everyone listening, thanks for being here. I hope you all find some ways to take up a little more space this week.
Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it to be a resource for you in your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation journey. I hope you can continue the conversation with me over on social media by sharing your thoughts, offering your ideas and suggestions for future episodes, or just connecting. You can find me on Instagram at Inner Atlas Therapy. If you liked this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show in your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with a friend. This ensures that more people can find the pod and will amplify our message of body liberation for all. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a free Taking Up Space workbook available. This workbook will have you engage in self-reflection and embodied practices as you navigate your own journey of taking up space. You can find this free resource on my website, inneratlastherapy.com. I'll also link in the show notes some additional resources I've developed in my online shop to help you deepen into your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation work. Thanks again for being here. And until next time, I hope you join me in the resistance and find some ways to take up space this week. I'll see you next time.